In the 2024 American election, Black Americans, who historically have shown loyalty to the Democratic Party, made an astounding shift. At least 20% of African American voters supported Donald Trump this time, a significant increase from his 10% support in the previous election. This raises an intriguing question. Could this shift in support be tied to private promises made by Trump to Black businessmen and leaders, or could it be an indication of a broader push for reparations for slavery? Given the waning faith in Kamala Harris, particularly around the issue of reparations, it's possible that there were behind-the-scenes discussions that influenced Black voters' decision. In this video, we'll explore Trump's stance on reparations, his campaign promises, and his plans for Black Americans moving forward. Let's dive in. After decades of debate, the conversation about reparations for slavery took a crucial turn when California took the lead in 2023. The state's Reparations Task Force was created to examine the lasting effects of slavery and find feasible ways to address the damage caused by centuries of racial discrimination. The task force proposed a daring solution: direct cash payments of up to $350,000 to eligible African Americans by 2023. This proposal raised a critical question: should other states launch similar studies and implement comparable measures? Alternatively, could such a proposal be made available to all states nationwide? As the 2024 election approached, the question of reparations became a key dividing line between the candidates. Kamala Harris argued that the issue of reparations needed thorough investigation before any action could be taken. She emphasized the complexity of the issue, shifting the focus from direct payments to her broader economic agenda, which aimed to empower Black communities through systemic changes. Harris advocated for programs that would provide African Americans with equal opportunities, including initiatives focused on increasing wealth through entrepreneurship, homeownership, and access to capital. While she recognized the importance of reparations, she was cautious about committing to direct cash payments, focusing instead on long-term structural changes to address economic disparities. In contrast, Donald Trump's approach to reparations and his platform on race-related issues were markedly different. While his position on reparations in previous years was one of opposition, arguing that they would exacerbate racial divisions and unfairly redistribute wealth, his 2024 campaign seemed to take a different tone. The increased support from Black voters raised the possibility that Trump might have made specific promises, potentially about reparations, or other measures aimed at addressing historical injustices that resonated with African Americans. In the debate over reparations, Trump and Harris both found themselves on opposing sides of the issue. Harris's focus on systemic reform and her reluctance to commit to direct payments contrasted sharply with Trump's stance, which in the past has been skeptical of the effectiveness of reparations. His campaign promises, however, indicated that the conversation on reparations was likely to continue, and the public debate over how best to address slavery's legacy remains far from settled. What's clear is that the 2024 election has shifted the focus of national discourse on reparations, highlighting the need for a deeper conversation about how to rectify historical wrongs and address the long-lasting effects of slavery. The question now remains: will Trump move forward with policies that address these historical injustices, or will his focus continue to be on other issues that appeal to his broader base? Only time will tell, but this shift in African American voting patterns signals that reparations, whether through direct payments or systemic reforms, are a major point of contention in American politics. Kamala Harris made it very clear that reparations are a complex issue requiring further investigation. It has to be studied, she said, recognizing the need for a deeper understanding of how to address the damage caused by centuries of racial discrimination. Her cautious approach reflects her awareness of the delicate political nature of the matter, and her decision to call for additional study helps maintain her position without alienating swing voters. By doing so, she keeps the conversation open while ensuring she doesn't commit to a specific plan, especially in politically divisive regions. Harris's broader economic platform, which focuses on empowering Black Americans through programs aimed at increasing wealth and creating opportunities for entrepreneurship, homeownership, and access to capital, contrasts with the idea of direct monetary reparations. She sees this approach as a long-term solution to the racial wealth disparity, tapping into the ambitions and aspirations of black communities who seek financial autonomy and the chance to build generational wealth. On the other hand, as Trump secured his victory in the 2024 election, the discussion turned to his views on reparations. Most black Americans were caught off guard by his triumph. But now, as president, his stance on reparations for slavery will undoubtedly have an impact on the lives of millions. Unlike Harris and other Democratic candidates, such as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who had already begun to propose various forms of compensation for the descendants of enslaved Africans, reparations were not a major talking point during Trump's 2016 campaign. At that time, Trump rarely brought up the issue, as it wasn't a central concern for most voters. When asked about it, he promptly dismissed the idea, expressing doubt about its feasibility. He argued that reparations would widen existing racial divides rather than fostering unity. For Trump, the idea of reparations seemed like a political maneuver by the Democrats, aimed at winning black voters, not a genuine attempt to rectify past wrongs. The call for reparations gained momentum again after the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and the killing of George Floyd, but Trump's opposition remained steadfast. Rather than responding to demands for reparations and other forms of racial justice, his administration doubled down on a law and order stance, emphasizing support for law enforcement. Trump repeatedly argued that reparations would unjustly punish people who had no direct connection to slavery, viewing it as a form of unfair wealth redistribution. Instead, he advocated for economic policies such as tax cuts and job creation, believing these measures would have a more substantial positive impact on the black community. Trump's opposition to reparations didn't subside after he left office. He continued to criticize the idea in speeches and media appearances, presenting himself as a fierce opponent of woke culture and using reparations as an example of what he saw as misguided left-wing policies. For Trump, reparations were just another tool used by the left to create division, rather than a solution to the nation's historical injustices. The reparations debate remains at the forefront of American political discourse, with differing perspectives on how best to address the legacy of slavery. Kamala Harris's focus on systemic changes and long-term wealth-building strategies contrasts sharply with Trump's firm opposition to direct reparations. As we move forward, the question remains whether the country can find a path to healing that acknowledges the deep historical wounds caused by slavery while addressing the inequities that persist today. Trump's sudden shift in tone has left many observers perplexed, especially given his past rhetoric and policies regarding race. His attempts to broaden his base by reaching out to disillusioned white voters and Asian Americans, particularly through his attacks on affirmative action, were clear signals of his strategic pivot. He framed these actions as a way to address what he perceives as reverse discrimination, especially regarding Asian Americans who, according to Trump, were unfairly treated in favor of other minority groups. This shift reflected his desire to reshape the national conversation on race by focusing on issues that he felt progressive policies had ignored or mishandled. However, just before the 2024 election, Trump shocked many by unveiling a proposal that he claimed was a new form of reparations. But the focus was not on compensating the descendants of enslaved Africans. Instead, his proposal centered on combating what he called racial bias in schools. In a campaign rally in November 2024, Trump outlined a plan to file federal civil rights lawsuits against educational institutions accused of racist admissions practices. The proposal also included hefty fines for schools found guilty of such practices, with the fines used to compensate students who had experienced discrimination, particularly Asian Americans. Trump presented this as an effort to combat modern-day prejudice and to advocate for merit-based admissions. But critics quickly labeled it as an attempt to reframe reparations in a way that would exclude African Americans. Civil rights organizations and commentators pointed out that his focus on contemporary issues, such as reverse discrimination, ignored the historical legacy of slavery. The shift away from addressing Black Americans' centuries of systematic oppression in favor of supporting policies that could appease other groups with more immediate grievances, like Asian Americans, left many Black voters feeling let down. The proposal to fine universities for perceived racial bias seemed to many like an effort to redirect the conversation about reparations. Trump's call for fines to be funneled into compensation for victims of discriminatory admissions practices was interpreted by some as an attempt to shift the focus of reparations toward a new group, white Americans in particular, who Trump suggested were harmed by policies like diversity, equity, and inclusion DI programs. Many black voters, who had hoped Trump would support direct reparations for the descendants of enslaved people, found his statements disappointing and misguided. Trump's long-standing opposition to DI programs and critical race theory, which he claims divide society and marginalize white people, played a significant role in the framing of his proposal. Dismantling these programs was a key goal of his Project 2025 plan, which outlines his potential agenda for a second term. Trump argued that these programs unfairly disadvantaged white Americans, making them a central focus of his push to reform race-related policies in the country. For many black Americans, the proposal felt like a missed opportunity to address the deep historical injustices caused by slavery. Instead of a focus on reparations for black Americans, Trump seemed to be redirecting the conversation towards defending white Americans from what he perceived as modern-day injustices. This left many in black communities feeling betrayed, as they had hoped for a broader acknowledgement of the long-standing impacts of slavery and racial inequality. As discussions about reparations continue to unfold, it's clear that Trump's evolving position has raised more questions than answers. His shift towards advocating for policies aimed at alleviating perceived grievances of his base, rather than directly addressing the legacy of slavery and systemic racism, has left many wondering whether he will prioritize the concerns of his supporters or take meaningful action to right the wrongs of the past. For many black Americans, the idea of reparations is still very much alive, but Trump's actions and words over the years make it seem highly unlikely that he will be the one to deliver on these promises. Are you in agreement with this assessment, or do you see potential for a shift in his approach to reparations as he continues his bid for a second term? Black America's support for Donald Trump in the 2024 election raises an important question. Is it based on genuine disappointment with the Democratic Party, or does it indicate a shift in attitudes toward reparations? Or is it all simply rhetoric? As we reflect on this, we must consider whether Trump intends to address the long-standing issue of reparations for slavery, or if his support from black voters is driven by a sense of disillusionment with the policies and promises of the Democratic Party. It's also important to evaluate whether his actions will result in real change for black Americans, or if this support is part of a larger political maneuver that doesn't address the deep-rooted issues of racial injustice. Given Trump's past statements on reparations, it's hard to imagine him taking significant steps toward compensating the descendants of enslaved people. His rhetoric has largely focused on opposing policies that he claims create division in society, such as diversity, equity, and inclusion DI initiatives, which he argues unfairly favor certain minority groups over others. This shift in focus toward merit-based policies and supporting groups like Asian Americans appears to sideline reparations for slavery and shifts the conversation toward what he perceives as reverse discrimination. While Trump has shocked many with his unexpected support from black voters, it seems unlikely that his administration would prioritize the moral and financial obligation of reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. The controversy surrounding reparations is immense. For many, the concept of reparations remains an abstract and politically contentious topic, one that has been portrayed in a way that makes it hard to believe it will ever come to fruition. However, as the debate continues to gain traction in various levels of government, some are beginning to view reparations not as a distant possibility, but as an urgent moral necessity. The U.S. government can no longer avoid this conversation. It is clear that the effects of slavery have reverberated through generations, and the systemic inequities that persist today cannot be overlooked. In recent years, proposals for reparations have gained more attention, with suggestions ranging from direct payments of $350,000 to the more recent proposal of $151 million per person. With approximately 14% of the U.S. population identifying as black, this raises the question: who will pay for these reparations? And will every African American receive their fair share? The issue becomes even more complex when considering the wealth that has been passed down from generations of white families who benefited from slavery. The fortunes accumulated by white slave owners did not vanish after slavery was abolished. Instead, they were passed down to future generations, perpetuating a cycle of wealth inequality between black and white Americans. As a result, black Americans today continue to face drastically different levels of prosperity, educational attainment, and career opportunities. This historical injustice is undeniable, and the moral argument for reparations becomes stronger when we consider that white Americans, whose ancestors profited from the enslavement of Africans, continue to benefit from this legacy. The argument against reparations often comes from those who claim they should not be responsible for the actions of their ancestors. However, this argument fails to acknowledge that the wealth accumulated by white slave owners continues to benefit their descendants, while black Americans have been systematically excluded from wealth-building opportunities. The idea of reparations is not just about compensating those who directly suffered under slavery. It's about addressing the historical and ongoing wealth gap created by centuries of systemic racism. As the conversation about reparations continues, the pressing question remains: how will this massive undertaking be funded? No government currently has access to the kind of resources required to pay out reparations on the scale proposed. Some suggestions include using the land and wealth that has been passed down through the families of white supremacists, as well as targeting the financial institutions and businesses that continue to profit from this legacy. Ultimately, the question is not just whether reparations will be paid, but whether the United States will finally take responsibility for the historical wrongs that have shaped the country. The legacy of slavery cannot be ignored, and it is imperative that the U.S. government find a way to make amends, not only through financial restitution, but also through systemic reforms that address the racial wealth gap, educational inequality, and barriers to economic opportunity that continue to affect black Americans today. Will Trump prioritize reparations? Or is his sudden shift in rhetoric just another example of political maneuvering? Time will tell, but for many black Americans, the hope is that this conversation will not be sidelined again. What do you think? Will reparations for slavery ever become a reality in the United States? Or is it all just rhetoric? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell icon to stay updated on this ongoing debate and more. The argument against reparations for descendants of slaves, that they should not receive compensation because they were not directly subjected to the brutalities of slavery, is strikingly similar to the argument that descendants of white supremacist slave owners should not be allowed to keep the wealth generated by slavery. If we accept that the descendants of enslaved people should not be compensated, we would also have to argue that those who continue to benefit from the wealth accumulated by slave owners should forfeit their inheritances. From both a legal and ethical standpoint, it is clear that the descendants of enslaved African Americans, who continue to face systemic racism and economic disparities, are the rightful claimants to this wealth. Black Americans have suffered significant financial losses due to racism for centuries, with estimates suggesting that these losses amount to a staggering $70 trillion. This historical wealth disparity is intricately linked to this vast cost. For instance, in 2016, the average wealth of middle-class white families was $49,703, while black families had an average wealth of just $4,113, or 8.6% of the wealth of white families. This gap is not simply a result of individual effort, but reflects the long-lasting economic effects of slavery and institutionalized racism. As Sean Rochester explains in his book, The Black Tax, the cost of being black in America, black Americans have endured economic losses amounting to $70 trillion over the course of several generations. These losses stem directly from slavery, Jim Crow segregation, discriminatory policies like redlining, and exclusion from opportunities that white Americans were able to access. The wealth created by the labor of enslaved Africans in the U.S. is estimated to be worth anywhere from $24 trillion to $97 trillion, with a median estimate of $50 trillion. Yet, despite contributing to the nation's economy, black Americans own only about 2% of the wealth in the U.S. today. The government has repeatedly excluded black Americans from opportunities that were available to white Americans. For example, The Homestead Act of 1863 denied Black Americans the right to receive 160 acres of land for farming, land that was later claimed by mostly white homesteaders. Over 70 years, these homesteaders took 270 million acres of land worth $1.6 trillion, while Black Americans were systematically excluded. Additionally, Black Americans lost billions due to discriminatory policies in Social Security and the GI Bill, which left them out of programs that would have helped them build wealth. Examples like the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, where Black-owned businesses in the affluent Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, were destroyed by white mobs, further exacerbate the wealth disparity. Throughout U.S. history, Black Americans have faced not only exclusion from wealth-building initiatives, but also violent and economic repression, preventing them from accumulating wealth and passing it on to future generations. The racial wealth gap remains glaring, with white families holding, on average, 10 times as much wealth as Black families. For instance, white college graduates have 7 times more wealth than Black college graduates. This is not simply a reflection of individual effort, but a consequence of centuries of racial exclusion from opportunities for wealth accumulation. While the idea of reparations has often been dismissed as a hopeless cause, history shows that reparations are not a new concept for the United States. Native Americans have been granted land and financial compensation for the forced removal from their ancestral lands. Japanese Americans received reparations for their internment during World War II, and Holocaust survivors have been compensated by Germany. Yet, no group in the U.S. has received reparations for state-sanctioned racial discrimination, except for Black Americans. The 40 acres and a mule policy proposed during the Reconstruction era by General William Sherman, which would have granted Black families 400,000 acres of land and mules, was reversed after President Abraham Lincoln's assassination. President Andrew Johnson allowed the land to be returned to the former slave owners. Since then, the U.S. government has consistently failed to provide Black Americans with the reparations they are owed, despite benefiting from their labor. In order for the United States to achieve true racial equality, it must address the historical wrongs committed against Black Americans. Reparations should include not only direct monetary payments, but also investments in education, housing, and business ownership, leveling the playing field for Black Americans who were systematically denied opportunities to build wealth. The racial wealth gap cannot be solved by promoting individual effort or behavioral change alone. It is the result of centuries of exclusion, and only systemic change can rectify the damage done. The idea of reparations is not a hopeless cause. It is a necessary step toward justice. A federal reparations plan is essential for the U.S. to truly fulfill its promises of liberty and equality for all. The proposal for reparations, such as the Reparations Now bill introduced by Representative Cori Bush in 2023, would provide $14 trillion in compensation for the harms done by slavery and segregation. While 74% of Black Americans support reparations, only 26% of white Americans agree, highlighting the ongoing racial divide and resistance to acknowledging historical injustices. The solution is clear. Reparations for Black Americans are not just a matter of financial restitution, but a moral obligation for the United States. The federal government must take responsibility for its role in perpetuating slavery and racial discrimination, and it is long past time for reparations to be paid. Only then can the U.S. begin to heal the wounds of its past and address the structural inequities that continue to affect Black Americans today. So, do you think reparations are the right step toward addressing the injustices of slavery? Or do you feel the concept is too vague or unrealistic? Should the U.S. government finally make reparations a reality? And how do we ensure it is implemented fairly? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want us to continue making videos on these important topics, please hit the bell icon and subscribe channel for more content.